evening, everyone. Welcome to P A Minar, our monthly online gathering for live theater prop professionals and anyone interested in stage props. I'm Monique Walker, founding SPAM member, and SPAM member Natalie Kearns joins me tonight. SPAM is an association of professional prop educators and prop managers for nonprofit producing organizations with an international communication support network that shares resources, information, solutions, and techniques, as well as safety information, continuing education, and stock. We promote the highest professional standards among prop artisans and craftspeople, as well as the field of props to potential prop professionals, while working to establish educational standards for the training of early prop artisans and students. SPAM was formed in 1994 to create a fellowship among properties professionals to address issues of common importance and to create parity with other production areas. We now have over 150 active members reaching from Hawaii to Ireland, Canada to Florida. As with previous prop spaminars, we're requesting pay what you can donations to help us support this programming and our annual grants for early year prop professionals. If you can afford to donate, the link will be in our chat during the session, and we truly appreciate anything that you could give. Tonight, Natalie Kearns, SPAM member, head of props at the Grand Theatre in London, Ontario, Canada, and proud member of IATSE 828, will talk with us about paper props. She'll look at some of the paper props we might run into while propping a show and give us some tips and tricks to give them an authentic look while still meeting the demands of stage use. Excuse me. She has also created an excellent resource sheet for us. Check the chat box for the link to that. Natalie is a graduate of Emerson College with a BFA in Theater Design and Technology and has worked across North America. She was the assistant prop master for Trinity Repertory Company in Providence, Rhode Island, where she worked as prop master for the Brown Trinity MFA program. She also worked at the Watermark Theater on Prince Edward Island, Central City Opera in Colorado, and at numerous companies in the Boston area. She completed an apprenticeship at the Huntington Theater Company and work placement at the Royal Shakespeare Company in Stratford-upon-Avon. In her spare time, she makes and sells pottery and is an avid pub trivia player and dog mom. Now, I'll be your moderator and host for the evening. If you have questions, please post them in the chat and I will pose them to Natalie during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. Be sure to stay to the end to hear about our upcoming spaminars and other ways you can interact with and learn from our membership. And with that, let's get started, Natalie.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Monique.
You're welcome.
I am a dog mom, so and I'm the only one home here with him. So if we hear a little barking, that's what's happening, but he's sleeping right now. So I think we're safe. So yes, thank you everybody for joining me tonight. I'm coming to you from my home here in London, Ontario. I'm excited to say that tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. after about 16 months away, I'm headed back into my shop finally, but my theater just completed a massive renovation. So I couldn't host this from there because my shop is currently completely empty, and that's what faces me tomorrow morning is the joy of reorganizing and moving back in. So I'm very excited. But tonight I'm going to share a lot of my tips and tricks through a PowerPoint. So I've got some videos that I pre-filmed and some visuals. And then I also have some stuff here behind me. If at the end we have questions, hopefully I can grab some stuff and hold it up. I did a little sneak into the theater to grab things that I could find that were not packed up. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen here and we will dive into things. So let's get it nice and big. Ooh, she can do animation. All right, so tonight we're talking about paper props, as you all know, and paper props can cover a whole bunch of things. Obviously, pretty much anything made out of what we would consider paper, but then of course, things like scrolls. We're going to cover stuff like fast food wrappers and bags. So things with graphics on them as well that come up in props that you may be called upon to create. So this was a brainstorm of some of the various things that you may be asked to create for a show, but certainly not the end all and be all. I'll say at the beginning of this, a lot of what I'm focused on tonight is paper props as they relate to the Western canon of theater. We're going to touch a little bit on some history of paper as it relates to other parts of the world, but primarily we're looking at writing that uses what we know as the standard English alphabet that we all use. But obviously there's a broad world of graphics and information out there from other cultures as well that you may come across in props. So just a quick background on me. You heard a bit about me, but paper props for me is something I've always had an interest and passion for. And I actually got my job at Trinity Rep because my portfolio had a lot of paper props in it. And my boss who interviewed me there for the job was somebody that didn't have a lot of experience or love for doing paper props. And it's one of those funny things in props that either I find prop masters and prop artisans love to do, or they hate it and it's the very last thing and they just want to get it over with. So maybe tonight will inspire some of you paper props haters to become paper props lovers like me. So we're going to take 2 seconds here to watch a chunk of a piece that was uploaded to YouTube called Great Big Story. It features film prop master Ross McDonald, and I encourage you to watch the whole thing. He goes into some of his background and techniques. But what I think it does is it gives us a beautiful look at reasons why paper props are important as part of the world of the stage. So here we go. So I'm going to leave you on that cliffhanger. The whole featurette on him is excellent. But I just thought the beginning really summed up beautifully why paper props can be an important piece of the show. And often we see in sort of classical theater canon, like Shakespeare, they use a letter to tell us a lot of information that just happened off stage. Obviously, for those of us who are working in big proscenium theater, the people seeing the paper props up close may only be your actors. But for me, that's one of the things I really love about being a collaborator. If I can do my job to make a piece of paper on stage be as true to the real thing as possible, that's one less thing the actor has to think about, and they can focus really on living in the world of the play. So one of my proudest moments was in a dress rehearsal of Mary Poppins. We had just incorporated paper props into the show, and the actor playing Mr. Banks on a hold exclaimed, "I love the props department here," because the letter that he opened for that scene had the letterhead of the company and it had a signature, and all the text was authentic to what that letter would be rather than just some like lorem ipsum filler text. So for me, it's a bit of my love letter and relationship back with the actors, and part of my way of telling stories and participating in the show. So when I come upon a paper prop that's going to go on stage in a script, I ask myself a bunch of different questions, and that's really going to determine how I approach the piece. So what is the purpose of the prop? Are we in a black box or are we proscenium? Like, how much is the audience going to see? If it's a headline in a newspaper, they're going to read that. If it's some tiny text, probably not. Is your text specific? Is it something that comes in the script, or are you going to make it up? Or are you working with an actor that would rather have text that is nonsense? Some actors prefer that, and that's always a discussion you can have with your stage management team. Is this a 3-performance show, or is this a show that's running indefinitely and the letter on stage gets destroyed every night? That's really going to change your approach for how you're making your paper prop. What do you need to make it accurate to the period of the show, or at least from the audience, passable for that period? And then, does this piece of paper look new in the show, or is it something from the past that people in the time of the show are looking at? So are we aging it, or is it brand new? So lots of questions before we dive into actually making what we're doing. So we're going to nerd out here for just a few minutes. I'm going to speed through this, but I think it's interesting, at least for me. Some of you are probably like, oh, Lord. But a bit of history of paper, right? Because paper's been around a lot longer than I think a lot of us can fathom in our minds. So the oldest paper that we have that we can date dates back to 179 BCE to the Han Dynasty in China. made of scraps of rags and fishing net and mulberry fibers and hemp waste. So people in the world have been making paper for a really long time. But if we're doing a show way back, we also have papyrus, which you're probably familiar with if you've been to a museum of ancient Egyptian artifacts, and other Mediterranean civilizations. That's a plant fiber. And then here in North America, the indigenous people of the Mayan civilization and Mesoamerica use something called a mate, which is actually similar to modern paper. They used bark and soaked it and made a paper-like substance. It's actually closer to traditional paper than even papyrus is. And that's going back 75 AD. So people have been writing on things other than stone for a long time. But when it comes to plays, the majority of the canon that we encounter is either going to have paper as we acknowledge it, or parchment and vellum, which is an animal skin, an animal hide that's been scraped and treated down to a very tough membrane. So vellum traditionally is only from a calf skin, and then parchment, sheep, goat, or cow. This goes way back to ancient Greece, developed in 5 BCE. In the Islamic world, also was in use, but fell out of favor because the Islamic world and the in Asia, paper technology came a lot quicker than in Europe. So parchment's around, but falls out of favor when Europe gets paper manufacturing. So that's the latter half of the 15th century, so our 1400s. So the vast majority of plays that you're ever going to do on stage, they probably had paper. So by the middle and late 15th century, paper is pretty much universal across the world where people are doing writing or printing. Formal documents, legal contracts, religious texts can be on parchment and vellum. And to this day, I know in like British law, sometimes new laws are written out on a parchment, but for the most part, you know, since the 1400s, we've had paper. Up top there is the Gutenberg Bible from 1450. It looks pretty familiar to us when we think of paper. If you're doing film and you want to get really nerdy, you can go back and do research of the exact way the paper was made in the time. So laid paper, you can see those fine lines in that piece at the left. That's from the manufacturing process, 1200s to 1800s. And then in the 1900s with the Industrial Revolution, we came into the type of paper we make today, which is wove paper. And then on the right, kind of looks like watercolor paper to us. That's cotton rag paper. And again, a lot of paper, early Victorian era, pre-industrial revolution, made out of scraps from rag pickers. So actually poor people could make a living gathering scraps of paper and fabric and then selling it to the paper manufacturers, and they would make it into paper. And if it wasn't cut, you'd have that raw edge from the mold, and that's a decal edge. So you'll see that on old paper sometimes too. And then those of us that were around, I just missed the typewriter by a little bit, but the onion skin is a thinner paper you'll encounter sometimes for modern plays, and of the you know, early typewriter era through the 90s. And that allowed you to use carbon paper to make a quick copy. And it's also similar to airmail paper, which is light as possible for getting a lot of mail on an airplane without a lot of weight. So just fun to know a bit of the history. And then same with pens. This is one thing that comes up a lot, and I think we sort of forget, and I'm going to print myself out a little reference for this for my shop in the future, but sort of pre-1800s, for most places, quills were our primary writing tool, and pencils have been around in their wood form since the 1500s. Metal nib pens, oops, I've clicked myself out here. What happened? There we go. So metal nib pens, which are the second one there, a dip pen, that goes into production in the 1820s. So that's when we see the move from that really broad quill to a really thin, more sharp writing. And that's because we've switched to writing with a metal pointed tip. The 1850s bring us the fountain pen. And then the fountain pen remains popular basically through the end of World War II when the ballpoint pen arrives. So it's patented earlier, but its big popularity comes post-war. And then by the 60s, it's pretty much our universal pen, and probably the one that's on your desk today, unless you're a real fancy person and you like your fountain pen. So I did a little quick test here. We've sped it up. I'm a speedy writer. So that's our quill pen there. And you can see sort of the variation in thickness, much broader stroke. Here's a nib pen, a dip pen. So I have to dip it in the ink. And then these are two modern versions of fountain pens that work much in the same way that an older fountain pen would. So the ink is in there and you've got that much sharper style. So you can see the pretty distinctive jump from the quill to the dip pen. And that's always a good thing to remember for what your text on your document would look like if you're sort of pre the 1820s. So there again, I've just given you some quick references of where I got my fountain pens, what ones I was using. You can buy dip pens at pretty much any art store and play around with those. So that's a great thing to have in your prop stock for, you know, signing letters or for actors to have on stage for the right periods. And you can make yourself a quill pen pretty easily. There's lots of tutorials out there. So we're not going to get heavy into that, but it's a fun thing to play with if you want to handwrite a document from that time period. Another thing that I always like to think about, and again, this is a silly fiddly detail, but we're talking about the art of authenticity here. So, and I'm a nerd for typefaces. So the way that people wrote changed over time, and I haven't found a really great resource on this, and obviously it's going to depend on the society, the place where people were living, how they learned to write. But there's sort of an overall style that goes throughout, I guess what we would say is the Western world with our Roman alphabet. And these are just some of the changes in handwriting style over the time. So the top right there is what we would see Shakespeare's handwriting, the style, the secretary hand. We've got lots of fancy Spencerian script, which you might know as the Coca-Cola font, was big in the 1850s to 1925. So lots of different ways that people wrote throughout history. And it's always a fun thing to have in the back of your mind as you're deciding what the text on something that's meant to be handwritten should look like. So we're going to talk about fonts here for a second as we're talking about handwriting. This is a cool website called oldfonts.com, and they actually have a package of fonts that are historical handwriting throughout time based off of existing pieces of text. They've created fonts from them. It's not super cheap, $149 for all of them, but a kind of cool investment if you're a paper props nerd like me. I'm going to try to get my theater to approve the purchase of these for this season. But it's also just a cool, quick thing to look at when you want to sort of see an example of handwriting from a specific time period. And then fonts. If you're not a big computer person and you didn't know, you can install fonts onto your computer. So one of my favorite websites is dafont.com. And these are just some of the many, many free fonts that are on there that are great for faking handwriting. Obviously, people's handwriting varies as they move across the page, and a font is pretty standard, but for stage use, again, for most of us, it's the actor seeing this and the audience only seeing the overall impression of the piece. So it's a really cool website, and I'm sure there's a million tutorials out there on the internet of how to install fonts on your computer. So we're not gonna get deep into that or into any of the computer program stuff. But it is one of my favorite websites, and there are a couple other ones out there. But what I love about this is it sort of sorts it by type of font as well. So it makes it easy to find. And I've kind of pulled some good ones. That Jane Austen font there on the bottom left is one that makes it on my stage pretty frequently. And then again, this sometimes is a designer decision. So if you're asked to make a big banner or something that the audience can see, but again, if you want to be a bit of a nerd and make a typeface decision, in that reference packet, I've included a bit of a timeline of paper and also typeface designs. So my motto is, when in doubt, no sans serifs before the 20s. And sans serifs means any font without those little hats on the end of the type. So you can see like Garamond on the end of the G, and the R, it's got the little ball, and the end of the M's, the little feet. But in 1816, we get our first clean, modern looking sans serif font without any of those little hats and feet. And then of course, our famous friend in 57, Helvetica, the modern font designer's dream, also a pretty famous sans serif, but not around to the late 50s. So just kind of a fun thing in the back of your mind if you're asked to come up with a cover for a book or something, you know, what fonts are around at the time. And then of course, I'm only touching on this briefly because this could be a whole other Spaminar, and I hope it is one day. Programs for making props, paper props on the computer, obviously Photoshop can be an investment if you're able, and there's different discount versions. But when I was freelancing, starting out in Boston, and I didn't have Photoshop, GIMP is a great open source free graphics program, similar in some ways to Photoshop, and there are lots of tutorials for both out there. So if you haven't learned those programs and you want, there are millions of resources, and hopefully we'll also be touching on that in a future session. Paper, here we go. We're getting into the real stuff now that we've covered the history. So there are millions of sheets and types of paper out there, and it's going to be different depending on where you live and where you have access and what your budget is. One thing that I always try to keep in mind when I'm starting to do a prop is a paper prop is that our props go on stage under a lot of light. And so cream beige paper under stage light can look pretty bright white. So in general, at my theater, unless we're doing a super modern play and we want a big impact, we pretty much never put white printer paper on stage because I'm working in a big, bright proscenium house, and that white paper looks white. It is bright, bright, bright. So I like to have a selection of gray and beige and sort of textured and modeled brown and beige papers in my stock at all times to choose from. And I always go in with the knowledge that they may read a lot brighter on stage than they look in my shop when I'm first working with them. Now, aging paper. So we live in this funny world as props people, right? And I'm sure a lot of you will identify with this. We're doing a play set maybe before 1960, 1950. And we think of items from that time as having an age to them that we see them with now. So for example, I did a show set in the 1930s, and I kept being asked to just dress things down and make them look dirtier and old, even though the fridge in the kitchen at that time would have been a new fridge in the 30s. Like, why was it dirty and brown? It would have been nice and white because they bought it in the 30s. But to us as modern people, when we see a fridge from 30s in the antique store, it has age to it. And the same thing happens a lot with paper. So sometimes when older documents go on stage, even when the show is set in the time that it's set, directors, designers, and the audience want them to feel like they feel to us as a modern audience. So that's always a good distinction to make with your designers and your team. But we're often called on to age paper that maybe would have looked a little whiter in the time that it actually was being used. So I've got a couple of different aging things here to show real quick. Obviously, the classic you may have done in elementary school is your coffee or tea staining. So this is instant coffee, about a tablespoon brewed. And I've pre-printed my document, although you could always dye your paper and print it after. We saw in the last slide, some of those older documents had sort of marks from either oxidization of acid or dust or particles, things called foxing, which is a thing that happens to paper as it ages. So you can always sprinkle on little bits of the instant coffee to get those age marks. I'm giving it a little dry here. When you dip dye paper, it tends to get weak pretty quickly. So this is a technique that I don't use a lot at my theater because it's hard to do in bulk. Obviously, it takes a bit of time, and to do more than one sheet at a time, if this is a piece that's getting handled every night for multiple shows, it's going to be hard for me. But it's a great and super cheap way to age down paper. If you're just doing a short run, or you're making something for a photo shoot or a movie or something like that. So there's lots of ways to experiment with it. There's lots of videos of people doing this on YouTube with various different methods of painting on the coffee, pouring on the coffee, etc. So now what I'm doing is this little template that I have is a great trick that actually was passed on to me by my predecessor at the Grand. These templates were left when I took over the job there. And they're just pieces of Luan wood cut to various standard paper sizes, but also sizes of paper from past shows. So I have one here labeled Pride and Prejudice writing paper. And the reason for that is it's a really, really quick and reliable way to cut a bunch of paper or tear a bunch of paper to the exact same size. So this is a 5x7. My paper is still a little damp, and I'm just using it and pressing it down to tear those edges. And that way I'm getting a bit of wear and tear, but I'm getting it to roughly the same size of every sheet that I would do. You could also always have your, when you print it, you could always put lines to cut on, but this again, yeah, it's just a fast and easy way to cut the same size of paper over and over again that I've really come to prefer. And I've left those edges, as we talked about, that decal edge. So that can be paper wearing away over time, but it can also be that time period of paper's untrimmed edge. So it's a nice, quick, fast way to do that also for tearing paper. Another way to age, for those of you that maybe have been doing props for a while, our old dear friend glossy wood tone. So I can find this at my local Michael's. You can also sometimes find it at a floral design company, a place that sells silk flowers. That's what it was made for. But it's a semi-translucent spray stain. It's real stinky. So if you're a freelancer, please don't do it in your house. Please do it somewhere where you have lots of ventilation. I'm here outside on my front porch. Once you get a handle of the way that the spray comes out, this is a new one, so I'm testing it out here and I'm getting a bit of spatter. But what I love about glossy wood tone is the various ways that it can give paper a bit of texture and a bit of color. And I love spraying paper with it before it goes on stage because it gives me a bit of that patina without a lot of work. And it's a great way if your paper's looking bright on stage and you're getting the note that it looks too modern. It's a great way to sort of dust it down. We love to call it our instant oldie-timey spray. It is smelly, so after you spray it, make sure you have time for it to off-gas a bit before you send it on stage. There's also different inks out there in the world right now. So this is one that you can buy at Michael's. There's this whole range from this guy. I think his name is Jim Holtz. And he does all this scrapbooking stuff. So this, I think, was about $7. And there's a bunch of tutorials out there of ways to apply it, but it's a great way to do a bit of like oxidization around the edge. It's also water soluble, so you can spray and then use the water to kind of smear and spread it around, get a bit of spattery stuff and a bit of aging on the edges of paper. And again, that just gives it some nice texture and some nice color highlights on the edge. In a pretty quick way. I've just got a piece of paper under it there to help me keep my work surface clean. So it's a fun thing to experiment with, and another tool that I'm going to add to my kit just for ways to add a quick bit of color to my paper props. Oh, somebody's unmuted. Okay, and then that book there in the center, Designing Graphic Props for Filmmaking, there's this incredible Irish paper prop maker. She does films, obviously, Annie Atkins. She's released a book last year of her collection of paper props and graphic design she's done for film. And this picture on the left is some of her various aging techniques. So that's in her book, and it's a lot of fun. Again, my friend Glossy Wood Tone. And then Design Masters also come out with something called Tint It. It's a much subtler version of Glossy Wood Tone. I personally don't find it super effective for stage use, but it's another tool that's out there. And if you have the budget to get it and experiment with, perhaps it can be useful for you. I wanted to mention briefly, because this is always a fun tip and trick, and I'm trying to jam all my classic hits in here. So wax seals, of course, a way of sealing letters or letters folded into envelope shapes. Before we had envelope adhesive, doing it the real way, as you can see with the little kits you can buy, takes a bit of time. The other downside to this is that they are very hard to open on stage. So a classic prop shop trick is to get your seal. I sprayed a bit of Pam on it so it wouldn't stick. And then we've got our dear friend, the glue gun here. So same amount as we do with our wax, give it a brief moment to develop a bit of a cool down. And then we can just set our seal in it and wait a couple seconds. It's great if you can invest in 1 or 2 seals if you need to manufacture a bunch of these at once. But after a few moments, sped up here, I'm walking around my living room. I have a little hot glue version of that seal. Conveniently, it's an N, and I didn't buy that one. And then with a bit of red paint, I believe these were spray painted, you can make a bunch of ready-made seals to go on your envelopes for show. And what's great is you can reuse them over and over. So you could always permanently glue down the top side that you don't want to go away from the letter, and then just put a tiny dab of double stick tape on the other side. It's a really easy way for to get the look, but have it easy for actors to open. And then at the end of the show, you can peel them off and use them again in another show. They're pretty durable. So that's a fun way to do wax seals on stage. So if you couldn't tell already, for me, it's all about the research. And whenever I'm looking at making a new paper prop, I love to look at examples similar to what the thing would have looked like in the time period. So the ones on the left are real letters from the mid 30s to early 40s. And then the ones on the right are versions that I recreated for A Christmas Story at the Grand Theater. So we're going to quickly go through how I might look at making this envelope. So this is an envelope sent during World War II, 1944. And the reason I chose it is it has a bunch of different layers that we can look at to establish our authentic props. So the paper that the envelope is made of is different than maybe our standard envelope paper would be. It's got a typewritten name, address, and return address. And then it's got a printed airmail stamp, and then a lot of ink stamps on it. So many, many different layers there. So my first step was the decision to make my own envelope. Making your own envelope is pretty easy, and you could do it fairly quickly if you make yourself a template. So I found this template online by just searching envelope templates. This is one I liked the size of, and it seems similar to our reference picture that we have back here. And then I laid it out in my favorite Word program. So this is Pages for Mac, but you could do the exact same in Word or OpenOffice. I have installed a font appropriately called Veteran Typewriter that I thought was pretty close to our reference font. And so I've typed it out, and then I've also found myself the same stamp. And I'm going to print that on there because it looks like this envelope had that stamp pre-printed. So when you bought the envelope, it came with the postage. So I've laid that all out here in my Word program, and I've got my template, and I'm going to print this. And this one is going to be my reference for when I go to cut out my final envelope. Then The next time I'm going to delete my template, because if I printed this on my final paper, we get all those dotted lines and edges, and we don't want those on our final product. Those boxes around the text are just telling me where the text boxes are, and those won't print, but the lines around the outside will. And so what I've done is I've deleted my template, but I've given myself 3 reference lines of where the top and sides of my, I don't think you can see my cursor, but the top and sides of my envelope will be. So when I lay this template on top, I'll know exactly where to cut it. So now I've got my template, which I've pre-cut out here. And then I've got my paper, which this is just some sort of beige textured paper that I think I purchased at Staples. And that's going to be my final envelope. So all I do is line up my template on those 3 marks that I found that I've put in to match up with the template pattern that I had on top. And this is going to be my address is in the correct spot, and everything is going to line up nicely. So I'm just using a little X-Acto knife and a metal ruler. These are pieces that I had in my home, and we're going to talk about in a second my actual preferred method of knife and knife safety when making paper props, because I would say, and I'm sure many of you are familiar, one of the more common injuries for a prop maker is cutting yourself with an X-Acto knife. And that doesn't have to be the way. In my shop, again, a credit to my predecessor and my coworker both introduced me to cut gloves, which are common for kitchens for folks who use knives for butcher work and things like that. So we're going to talk about those in a moment, but that's a great way to keep yourself safe. So here, as you can see, obviously I didn't speed this up super fast. I'm cutting, such a good job, my envelope out, and there she is. So my template has already told me where I need to fold, which is lovely. Templates are our friend, just like those wood ones I was showing you cutting or tearing paper with earlier. An envelope template is great. There are also ones you can buy for different cutting systems like Fiskars. Again, the scrapbook section is always a fun place to wander around. So that template told me just exactly where I needed to fold to make myself an envelope. Look at that. And then you may have something called a bone folder, which is a white piece of plastic, would have been ivory back in the day, hence the name, or bone. But I'm just using my ruler to really press and score down those edges, just like this was made by a machine, nice and crisp. And I have chosen here to use double stick tape because that's what I had in my house. But you could use a glue stick or any other adhesive of your choice, and maybe sharp scissors, because clearly mine were not going there. Right, so now we've got our envelope made. And if you remember, there were a couple of other things on the envelope. There were some cancellation stamps and postage marks. This is my favorite tip when you're making mail. If somebody's receiving mail that has come through the post system, it will have cancellation marks on it. And a lot of people forget this when they first start making paper props. So there are lots of stamps out there in the scrapbooking world that are meant to look like cancellation marks for kind of doing that cool vintage, steampunk, whatever style for scrapbookers. As you can see, these ones are kind of travel themed maybe, but for our stage use, who cares? And putting those on to an envelope, in my opinion, turns it from a prop to the real deal. So if we look back, that was our example, and I think we got pretty darn close. I chose not to do the Army Examiner seal there on the right, but obviously that's another layer you could add on if you wanted to. So just really when you're looking at stuff, looking at all the layers that are on, you know, something doesn't necessarily come off the printer or the printing press and then go straight into someone's hands. People may have signed off on it. People may have added notes in the margins. All those different layers really add the extra details and touch. Again, I can't emphasize enough, knife safety, top right, those are the cut gloves I was talking about. So anytime I'm using a knife in my shop, I'm wearing that glove on my non-dominant hand, the hand that's not holding the knife, so that if the knife slips, I have no chance of cutting the free hand. I really love these rulers on the bottom left with the handle. It lets you put pressure down on the thing that you're cutting, and really helps you get a nice accurate line. And then that dollar store container there on the right. I always like to have something like that around. My motto for cutting things is a sharp blade is a happy paper props maker. So as soon as your paper starts tearing or snagging, you snap off your Olfa blade or change your X-Acto knife blade and you put your old one in the container. When it's full up, you tape it, you label it sharps, and you dispose of it. So I like to have that around, reminds me to keep my blade nice and sharp, and it'll make your cuts nice and accurate and your props nice and clean. I'm jamming it all in here. So magazines and other booklets. This is one that baffled me when I first started out in props. So I knew that the manufacturers for magazines were not using a regular stapler. So you can buy a big stapler as shown down left and about to be shown in this video. This is a magazine that I made for a Christmas story. So I've designed this and printed this onto large tabloid size paper on our copy machine. You could do the same thing by getting it printed at your local office store or copy center. And then I folded it really nicely down the middle. Obviously you can see it's been stapled before, but for our purposes, I'm going to line up my pages and staple it again. So with our long form, here it comes. Look at that scroll. Our long stapler, we can really easily reach the center, right? No problem. Look at that. Right in. I'm stapling it in the wrong direction. Usually the prongs are on the outside, but we'll pretend she knows what she's doing. So long arm stapler, no problem. This is the first shop I've worked in that has a long arm stapler. So my old tried and true freelance method was my personal stapler here, one that I can swing open flat. And then I find myself a bit of foam. This piece is from my air conditioner installation. And then I just press the stapler straight down into the foam, and the prongs will stick into the foam. So when I peel it up and flip it over, my staple edges are sticking up, and then I can just manually fold them down. And I've got the same version of binding a little magazine or a bifold pamphlet of some kind together. And I didn't have to invest in the fancy stapler, which is, you know, great because I have a stapler. A regular one. Some other tips and tricks for magazines, because they're something that's going to come up a lot. The magazine on the left is one we had in stock, and it's an older magazine that was printed on a style of newsprint. So it doesn't have that glossy paper that we have nowadays. And we only really needed to see the cover. Again, I said I'm on a big proscenium stage. So for filler, we just got some of those free local real estate magazines that are always at street corners in those little vending boxes. And that's already printed on newsprint, and it makes a great interior filler for older magazines. Same with, sometimes you can find other like tourism guides or local ad things that are done in the same way. And then on the right there, that Ebony magazine, this is one I printed in 3 pieces. So sometimes people are like, oh, I don't have a big plotter or a big printer. I can't print a cover that will wrap all the way around. What I did for this one was just print the front and back covers. I think on an 8.5 by 11, but maybe slightly larger on a standard copy machine. And then on the spine, I just did some red electrical tape to cover up. So I did red electrical tape first and then glued the 2 covers on. Great, quick, cheap, easy way to convert an existing magazine to a specific color without needing a large format printer or any super specialized equipment that you couldn't get printed at a local copy center as well. You could also always print your spine separately, glue that on first, and then glue your front and back cover. So it is possible to, split up your graphics and make them really work in your favor on different surfaces. The dreaded newspaper. So we're not going to go heavy into this, but this was the bane of my existence as a freelancer. I didn't have access to a plotter that I could use on my own or a large format printer. I didn't have access to somebody that would put actual newsprint through a plotter. So nowadays I am able to use a large format printer on my own, and I can feed pieces of newsprint or rolls of newsprint that I buy from art supply stores through. In your resource sheet, there's a couple of businesses in the States, and I'm sure elsewhere as well, that will custom print newspapers for you, especially if you're doing big shows like Newsies. But back when I was freelancing, what I did for some of my lower budget shows was I would get my newspaper printed at Staples on standard white bond, regular printer paper. It is thicker and heavier than a standard newspaper, but the lovely thing about it is also stronger. And then what I would do is I'd lay it outside, and I would use my old friend Glossy Wood Tone and my other friend Design Master Gray Flannel, and from a distance I would mist my newspapers, and that would give them enough of a tone down that even in some of Boston's smaller black box spaces, I made some pretty good looking historic newspapers that were just printed at Staples and covered in spray paint. So it is one of the hardest things, I would say, in terms of paper props to conquer. You can always try talking to your local newspaper company and things and seeing if they'll do special prints for you. But it is, it was something I didn't find locally. So that was sort of how I would tackle that before I had access to a big printer. It's also always fun, for me at least, to investigate printing on other materials other than printer paper with your standard office printer. So that Marisol newspaper on the left there is actually a real New York Post that I went and bought. And then I just used a regular printer to print on a piece of newsprint the middle headline sections and glued those onto a quote unquote real newspaper. So by printing on the same material, I was able to sort of layer and fake the real thing with only adding the custom part of the graphic. So some printers are more finicky than others. I have a really crappy printer here at my house, and I convinced it to take a 5x7 piece of paper cut out of a lunch bag and for it to print a KFC logo. So something like this is a great way to do something like a custom printed bag or fast food item without needing to like actually print on the surface. So I could just glue that to my bag. Same thing with tracing paper or vellum. Nice translucency, can accept ink from a laser or inkjet printer. And it's actually what I used to print custom graphics on fast food wrappers for the Buddy Holly story. For something like tracing paper that may be too thin for your printer to really love taking it through, you can actually just temporarily use a bit of Scotch tape at the top and bottom of a regular piece of printer paper and sort of tie them together. Feed that through the bypass tray of your printer because the thickness of the printer paper will be better recognized by your printer. And then it will print on the side of your tracing paper. So that's how I did the French fry. If I can back up here, the French fry box or bags is I actually had that, and same with the wrappers around the burgers, is I actually put the tracing paper, temporarily stuck it to a piece of printer paper, put it through the printer, took it back apart, cut it, and made my little fast food wrapper. Oops. So a nice way to convince your computer and your printer to take a material it may not be familiar with. Obviously, do this at your own risk. If it's not a printer that belongs to you, you don't want to jam it with paper and ruin it. But, always I like to experiment. And then if I'm designing on a surface, a graphic for a surface that's not standard, another trick that I like to use is I have bought myself here at home for my freelance work just a real cheap inkjet combination printer that has a scanner on the top. So if I was asked to come up with a custom coffee cup graphic that I needed to print out, rather than trying to figure out the math of the curve of the cup and laying that all out in a complicated way in Photoshop, I sacrifice a cup and I rip it open and then I put it through my scanner. And then I use that as my template in my chosen graphics program to design the graphic that's going to go on top of it. So when I bring it into Photoshop or GIMP or whatever, I make sure it's sized, I use my measurement tool to check that it is the right size on my screen or on my final print layout. And then I design my graphic on top of that. Same for packaging. You can scan in the package that you're trying to do the paper, the design on top of, and then you've got a template already made for yourself. So again, templates are our friends. And this is a lovely and quick and pretty straightforward way to make one for exactly what you're trying to get that surface on. You can even do it in a series of scans and piece it together if you're doing something really large. So I'm trying to remember what my coworker put through the scanner, but she had to scan it in sections and then she pieced it all together in Photoshop. So for example, like Assassins, the KFC bucket. If you wanted to make the correct period KFC bucket, you could always cut a real one, lay it flat, scan it in sections, and then build your graphic on top, print it, and then it'll fit perfectly. For surfaces, some plotters and printers can print on fabric, but the printer that I currently have access to cannot. So to get on fabric or other tougher materials, that Wizard of Oz document there on the left is canvas. And for that, I simply designed that in Photoshop, printed it out, and then I hand traced it using carbon paper, a kind of old standard for making copies, to transfer sort of my pattern onto my piece of canvas. And then I just went over it in Sharpies. So that ensured I had nice, straight, clean handwriting, but I still got the sort of hand-drawn look that we were going for. Our friend on the right here in Titanic was supposed to have, she's representing the man who built the Titanic. And this was a high school show. She was unrolling these maps or plans for the Titanic on stage. So what that is we actually printed the plans on printer paper, on a plotter paper, so a large format, like a blueprint. And then we actually glued them onto canvas and then sprayed both sides down with a bit of that with a bit of that glossy wood tone again, to give it a bit of texture and uniform color on both sides. And that allows it to become a really tough and flexible blueprint, and easy for her to roll up and unroll, looked correct for the time period, super durable. The same one lasts the whole show. And I often do that for larger pieces of paper that end up on stage. I mount them to either canvas or muslin fabric, and that allows it to last the whole run. So big things like maps in shows about war and stuff, also really great to mount on fabric for it to last on stage. One of my favorite tricks. And just a couple quick more helpful tools before we start to wrap up here, because I know we're getting close. As I mentioned before, stamps are really fun. And there are lots of stamps out there that look like handwriting that were made for scrapbookers and card makers. But for us prop people, the really nice thing about them is they are a great way to get handwriting into notebooks, or quickly, if you have to have a stack of papers with a bunch of different writing on them, you can quickly do a bunch of stamps. Just a great way to do filler, and a great way to get text in things that are already bound, like a book. So those are out there. And then also other kinds of stamps, as we talked about, to add layers and layers onto your paper props. Scissors as well, always lots of fun. These are
5 minutes, Natalie.
Great, I'm there. These are tickets I made for cabaret, and then I always love using textured scissors for cutting out my stamps. These ones perhaps not the best size for these stamps, but again, a nice little fun detail, a tool that's fun to have around in your shop. Can make lots of different textures on the edges of your paper for postcards, greeting cards, or tickets for cabaret. So there's lots of different fun things out there. The standard 3-hole punch, Yoo-hoo's my favorite glue stick. That thing up there in the center is a corner cutter, so it will automatically round the corners at different radiuses for you. Really, really great, cheap tool to have around for for making cards or different things like that, invitations, menus. We talked about my favorite spray paints, but Super 77 is my favorite spray adhesive. If you don't have access to a spray booth, it can be a bit tricky because it's, again, stinky and not good for in your house. But it's my favorite way to stick things together because I do have access to that. The thing on the left there, triple thick, just quick, is a glaze coating. So if you've made like a sign that you want to add a bit of gloss to, it's fun to experiment with. It's sort of a spray, shiny paint finish. And then of course, old friends like Mac Tack and HD Clear duct tape or packing tape are also just great ways to add a gloss and then a layer of protection as well to your final product. And very last but not least, I wanted to throw this in because I feel like it's something that I've established with my teams at the Grand that I really love. Paper props can get ruined just by living on your props shelves and your props tables backstage, and they can get confused pretty easily. They're small and in the dark, can be fiddly. So what I love to do is when I finish my paper props for a show, I put each separate prop and all of its backups into either file folders or I clip them all together. And then I put Post-it notes on them saying what page or scene or character, just so the stage manager doesn't have to interpret what all the props I'm giving them are. And then what they can do is at top of show, take out fresh ones, replace ones that are damaged, and then they've got a nice little stack of folders that they can keep safe either in stage management office or on top of the props cart, out of the way. They don't get confused with active props, and they've always got their backup there. It's also a place where if they need new extra paper props made, I can just deliver them right to their labeled folders, and everybody is happy. So a good way to communicate with your team. So that's what I have in terms of my little slideshow here. I'm going to stop sharing because I know I just dumped so many words on you guys. Can you tell I like paper props? You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. Great. It's time. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. Questions. There were a few that popped up in the gallery. Where do you get your stamp research?
There are a couple different websites. I can't remember if I put one in the, like, are we talking mail stamps?
Yeah, yeah, mailing stamps.
Yeah. There are a lot of stamp collectors in the world. So generally I just search like for the time. So 1935 USA. And then I find examples from ephemera websites or stamp collector websites. I don't know the names of any of them off the top of my head, but I think I probably put some in the resource document.
I used to have a big book and I just slap it on the printer.
That's the other thing.
The stamps, so I just color copied straight out of it.
Yes, there's about 1 million different books out there as well.
Stamps are big. Yeah. Okay. I had asked, and I put in some of my own notes, do you have a favorite, having done musical theater for 25 years of my career, do you have a favorite way to reinforce magazines? And
right.
We talked a little bit about that, but it has to be thrown and danced on. So,
right.
You had some favorite techniques.
I haven't had a massive problem like I'm doing runs of about 3 weeks, 5 weeks max at Christmas. Okay. So I have gone in, like if it's an existing real magazine, I've gone in to in between each page with like clear Scotch tape or packing tape, so that in the fold, I tape there, next page, I tape there, whatever. And then maybe I tape also along the spine. But in the case of like Christmas Story, where I was making the magazine, I made several copies to last us the run, just because, it is one of those things, the paper is thin. So, yeah.
Well, I've had shows that ran 3 months,
right?
All musicals. It's tough. Yeah. Yeah. There was a discussion about printing on Tyvek. Have you ever printed on Tyvek before?
Not personally, but I am aware. And yes, another great thing. It's something I want to experiment with more. I've also, for things like newspapers, when I want to print it on newsprint, but I don't want the thinness as much, I'll just glue two pieces of newsprint together so that I've actually got
That
one.
works well too.
The actual thing is thicker. There it is. So like this is my newspaper from Cabaret. So it's only one opening because he was on the train, but it's two pieces of newsprint. So it's pretty actually thick, but it still has the color and like texture and sound of newsprint.
Great. You sort of touched on it a little bit. There was a question about tips for building filler.
Right.
I mean, the print, the stamp was great. I don't know that I ever had one of those, but yeah.
Stamps are fun. Stacks of filler. I've done a lot of recently. We did Fully Committed and they just wanted like stacks of paper and things. So I've done a combination of like taking a bunch of sheets of paper, drilling through them, putting a thin piece of foam, couple more sheets, and then really fluffing up the edges. Because when you have a stack of paper, like obviously if it's all flat paper, it's going to lie flat. But if you crumple it a bit, each piece as you stack it, they start to get air between them and then the volume builds up and you get more height. And then to support it, because the edges will start to collapse, I then like put pieces of foam and then make sure that edge is over it. So I get more height, but I'm hiding the filler in between.
Right.
Yeah, it's always a tricky one. And then what I did for that show was I used pretty much all blank paper. And then I went and shoved sections of printed paper in between that were kind of sticking out more so that you could see the printed sections, but the rest was pretty much blank because it didn't get. The stuff that gets handled, I make 20, 30 pages of filler and I run them off and then I just throw them all on a table and scramble them around and hope they're not in order.
Cool.
Yeah.
There was a question about tips for building scrolls, which is sort of a different thing. I have a lot of Shakespeare experience, and I'd like to hear what you have used in the past.
Yeah, I haven't actually done a lot of Shakespeare. Most of the scrolls I've come across have been like Wizard of Ozzy musical theater. So most of the time I make them out of canvas, just with dowels or that. So it's not something I've done a lot of research on. What about you? What were your?
Well, it depends. I mean, it depends on the use, but I would buy, modern parchment and do the lettuce edge. And then I would coat them their way. That's crazy. I can't believe I'm still alive to tell about this, but we'd use orange shellac and denatured alcohol and it would crisp them up just enough. Do the same thing to muslin and it could work as scrolls as well. So
yeah, the muslin I love, and you can even glue the parchment paper to it on either side because you keep the flexibleness, but you get the durability.
Another question cropped up: best way to make magazine covers glossy but still flexible and realistic.
Jess's brochure paper, get it printed on it like a high quality laser printer. Because the printer that I use at work, our copy machines are pretty high quality laser copy machines. So I'm getting like this cover of Ebony was just printed on a printer on regular printer paper, but I've got a bit of gloss to it. You can also experiment with that crystal clear spray. It gives a bit of that shine without adding any like weight to it.
I have used, and also in the musical theater vein, I've used clear contact paper.
Yeah, I mean, that one's great, but if you're trying to go for the thinness of a modern magazine cover, it's not. So,
if it's not in the musical.
Right, the other crazy one I'm going to grab here. This is an ancient thing, but if you've never tried no tear paper, it's pretty wild. Like it's plastic.
It's good,
but it's thin. It's super strong. And when you print on it, like it has a bit of that glossy brochure finish. So it's fun for, I've made, this one has 3 holes, but I've made like brochures and things out of this because it, yeah,
And it holds up.
yeah. No
Should
tear.
we as theater prop artisans ever worry about copyright infringement with paper props? Well,
Yeah. I generally don't worry at the scale that I'm and the publicity of the place I'm at. The only times it has been a question or a problem are when your show's something like Nickel and Dimed, which like is about the bad things about Walmart. So you have to, they change the Walmart name in that show to a fake brand, and then everything is that fake brand, but you know it's Walmart. There's some companies like Tiffany's are very like, they won't give you a bag.
yeah.
And if the show is about like how we hate Tiffany's, that can be difficult.
Yep. It's true.
But so unless you're like going to Broadway, your performance is being filmed,
Right.
like
It's a commercial show. Yes, would have to.
yeah. And generally, as long as it's not defaming, like putting a business in a bad light, the from my understanding of past discussions, it's not a serious concern. The bigger concern is always prop money leaving the theater. If your prop
That is
too
a
good,
whole
and that's a whole
seminar in and of
seminar, and
itself.
that's why I didn't include it. My only tip for money that I'll tell you, and I brought my stack here, is my favorite thing that you're gonna hate this money. This was for cabaret. We were just making a political statement here. My favorite tip from, and it's double-sided the same, so we're not mistaking it, and slightly smaller. My favorite tip for money on stage is I always ball it up first and then flatten it out before I hand it on stage. Because unless your character's coming from the bank, most of our money looks more like that and not like it just left the printer. So I always crumple my money.
Yep. Let's see, there's a couple more questions. What's your favorite adhesive for gluing paper to muslin?
For me personally, I use Super 77, the spray adhesive, and I generally just spray the paper side, count to 5, and then stick it and press really well. I've never had any problems until recently when Super 77 had to change their formula due to Canadian aerosol standards, and now it's not as good, but I haven't found a replacement yet.
Oh, that toxicity makes it good. Yeah. Any tips for quieting paper bags for stage use?
What's wrong with people? I just went through this, and yeah, somebody has silent bags.
My kingdom for silent casters and paper.
Silent casters, bags, paper. Yes, so props, tricks, silent bags. There is also what's it called? Lee Valley Hardware sells what they call vegan leather, vegan paper tote bags or something, but it looks just like paper bags, and I cut them and or like glued them into grocery bags, and they're a plant leather, so it's softer and quieter, but it looks like craft paper. So there's a couple products out there.
Jen McClure has posted a link to PRO.
Well, yeah, that's what I was saying. Yeah, there's a couple
bag.
But it is, I think it's all made out of this like vegan paper leather, which looks like craft paper, but is more fabricy.
Ah, very good. Very good. Now come up with that magic non-existent caster that's silent.
I'm not an engineer.
My kingdom. Any other questions? I've reached the end of the list here. I'm just going to look real quick and make sure I'm not missing anything. Wolf Hagen says, I've had good results misting paper with water and throwing it into the dryer with a pair of shoes.
Yeah.
I think we've pretty much covered everything, and we're sort of, this is kind of the end of our time, I see up at my clock, right?
But I have, if you Google my name, I have an old website from when I'm happy in my job, but there's contact forms. So, and then also same on the spam group. I'm always happy to try to throw my thoughts on that. But like I said, not it's just something I'm passionate about and enjoy talking about. So thank you for indulging me, everyone.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Very, very informative. A lot of fun to see this good stuff. Now, everybody else, it's time to grab your Sharpies and mark your calendar for our next P A Minar. On August 15th, Jessica Rosenlieb prop master of the Cleveland Playhouse, will presenting tufting, tacking, and trim, tips and tricks for theatrical upholstery, which is the only kind I know how to do. There are more Spaminars currently in development, so stay tuned for updates. If there's anything you'd really like to see, please let us know in the feedback survey. And that will hit your inbox soon after we get off of this. And now some of you are probably wondering, how do I become a member of this great group, SPAM? Well, if you're a working prop manager, director, supervisor, master, or a similar title in a nonprofit theater opera company, or you're an educator in a college, university, and teach classes and prepare students for a career in props, and you're interested in joining SPAM, please send our membership committee an email for more information. And that email address is membership@propmanagers.org. You can find us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Links are in the chat. Spaminar is produced by the Society of Property Artisan Managers, with special thanks to SPAM members Patrick Drone, Ben Homan, Stacy Horn Harper, Nikki Kulas, Jay Lasnik, Amy Peter, and Karen Vance. Thanks again for watching. And once again, please keep your suggestions for future Spaminars coming. We want to know what you want to learn about. Prop on. We'll see you next time.